Sanderson has been a long friend of CPR, again, since we first started. He has been a recipient of our Earth Charter Award for his work in terms of building peace and building a culture of peace. And today we're going to hear about creating world peace. And this is a lifelong love and need for Sanderson and need for all of us. He has written he's written 33 books. He spent his life doing this. He's been arrested for civil disobedience many times over the years.
I'm grateful to Dr. Dodge and the CPR board for inviting me to speak to you today. Since I was born in Los Angeles 70 years ago, world population has tripled to nearly 7.5 billion humans. We now face the greatest crisis in human history, and to prevent the impending self-destruction, we must transform our society. What you hear from me and the excerpts from songs I have selected may astonish you or confirm your own ideas. My purpose is to awaken and inspire you so that we may all work together to save humanity. To help you understand how I have come to the radical ideas I now hold, I will briefly describe some experiences that have shaped my life. I believe in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution that protects us from government imposing religion upon us, but also gives us the right of religious expression. I would like to invoke the Spirit of God, and I ask those who may not believe in God to consider this an experiment. Father, Mother God, we ask that your light and love fill our minds and hearts so that we may understand this world and bring forth what is best for all. Amen. I was a happy child and liked school. In the fall of 1964, I attended the University of California at Berkeley and participated in the free speech movement. I earned a degree in dramatic art by the end of 1967 and continued on in graduate school. At that time, I could be drafted for the Vietnam War. I decided to apply for conscientious objector and studied religion and philosophy on my own. I told the draft board that I could not kill because we are all one, just as I would not use my right hand to hurt my left hand.
Fighting for democracy, he's fighting for the Reds. He says it's for the peace of all. He's the one who must decide who's to live and who's to die, and he never sees the writing on the wall. But without him, how would Hitler have condemned him at Dachau? Without him, Caesar would have stood alone. He's the one who gives his body as a weapon of the war, and without him, all this killing can't go on. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. His orders come from far away no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war.
I went to UC Santa Barbara for a master's degree in religious studies. My Chicano roommate was sent there by Cesar Chavez to study Gandhi and nonviolence. From Eastern philosophy, I learned about karma, which is the spiritual law of cause and effect. Every action causes an equal and opposite reaction. Karma is being responsible for what we create. We reap what we sow, and what goes around comes around. I call it the law of the infinite, as every action eventually returns to its source. Because the soul is infinite and eternal, we must live forever with what we do. Thus, the soul is always working to perfect itself by correcting any faults. Martin Luther King said, quote, The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, unquote. Jesus taught us not to fight back against violence with more violence.
There'll be times hard to control, and you'll find you'll hurt down in your soul. There'll be those who'll be glad to see you down, but don't give in. That old wheel will roll around again. That old wheel is going to roll around once more. When it does, it will even up the score. Don't be weak. As they sow, they will reap. Turn the other cheek and don't give in. That old wheel will roll around again.
After having mystical experiences, I dedicated my life to serving God and humanity. Excuse me. I believe I am a soul directly connected to God, and that all of you are also divine souls. In January 1970, I met John Roger, a clairvoyant who called himself a mystical traveler and founded the Movement of Spiritual Inner Awareness, MSIA.
Just be love, and all things will just unto you, and you'll be sure just what you should do. Wisdom is given just to a few. The light of God will see.
In 1972, I worked as a street youth counselor in West Los Angeles for 1 year, and that was the highest paying job of my life. Since then, I have not owed or paid income tax as I refused to pay for wars. I used astrology to promote self-understanding. We are now in the Aquarian age of knowledge and in a radical shift from the violent era of Kali Yuga to the Satya Yuga, the golden age of living love. In 1974, I published Across the Golden Bridge about people's experiences in MSIA.
Sail on, silver girl. Sail on by. Your time has come to shine. All your dreams are on their way. See how they shine. If you need a friend, I'm sailing right behind. Like a bridge over troubled water, I will ease your mind. Like a bridge over troubled water, I will ease your mind.
At UCLA, I became a PhD candidate in the philosophy of education. My thesis was Confucius and Socrates teaching wisdom. I taught more than 40 different college courses, mostly in philosophy and psychology, at the World University in Ojai. In 1981, I took a 6-hour nonviolence training and joined the 1,900 people who were arrested at the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. I spent a week incarcerated with men in an old gym. Talent shows included Wavy Gravy, Jackson Browne, and Grant Marcus of the PG&E Players.
Everybody's wondering if mankind is cursed. He's ruining the sky and the ocean even worse. But I'll predict the cause of his eradication from the earth. Oh, plutonium is forever. Now oil slicks someday will disappear. We'll stop dumping PCBs in a few years. But there is one pollutant that we should will it go away? For our purpose is never. It will be here past today. Yes, plutonium is forever.
My affinity group chose me as spokesperson, and at spokes council meetings, I got to know Eldred. He and I agreed that nuclear weapons are much more dangerous than nuclear power. He helped found the Livermore Action Group that was joined by Daniel Ellsberg. I worked on the Nuclear Weapons Freeze campaign, and in 1982 formulated World Peace Movement Principles, Purposes, and Methods. I joined the Vandenberg Action Coalition and was arrested with hundreds protesting the First Strike MX missile in January and March 1983. My trial was without a jury because the U.S. Supreme Court had decided that the constitutional right to a jury trial for all crimes does not include misdemeanors. I argued international law and defense of necessity, but I was convicted and appealed. At a long meeting in Berkeley, I drafted a letter stating our intention to stop testing of the MX missile. The letter was sent to every member of Congress. On the International Day of Nuclear Disarmament, about 1,100 people were arrested at Livermore. In this area, I helped organize the 12 who were arrested outside the naval base at Point Mugu, where cruise missiles were tested. We stayed outside a line in the street so that we could have a jury trial in state court. But the government claimed a mistake, and the trial was moved into federal court without a jury. I spent 2 weeks in the Ventura County Jail. I was also arrested twice that year in Los Angeles Catholic worker actions. When several people fasted on water for nuclear disarmament, I fasted on juices for 40 days. I sat in Congressman Lagomarsino's office, and he had the police arrest me.
There is no historical precedent to put the words in the mouth of the president. There's no such thing as a winnable war. It's the lie we don't believe anymore. Mr. Reagan says we will protect you. I don't subscribe to this point of view. Believe me when I say to you, I hope the Russians love their children too. We share the same biology, regardless of ideology. What might save us, me and you, is if the Russians loved their children too.
In 1985, I published Irene, Realizing World Peace, and mailed it to 1,300 peace organizations, including 200 outside the United States. I predicted that Germany would be reunified. In 1986, I published The Way to Peace. In 1987, I traveled to 47 states and met with more than 600 peace groups in an effort to influence the Democratic primaries. I agreed with Gorbachev's proposal to eliminate all nuclear weapons by the year 2000. Brian Wilson was run over by a munitions train in Concord, California. I joined activists there who were protesting weapons shipments to Central America. With Nuremberg actions, I was arrested more than 40 times for blocking trains. In a trial, I defended myself, read the Nuremberg principles to the jury, and was acquitted. I helped videographer Mark Copeland edit the video, stopping the war in its tracks.
Down in Nicaragua and El Salvador, bombs rain down once more to kill and maim. But this time I say no. This time I just have to go to try to stop the train that carries murder in my name. And you can't move that train. in my body.
In 1989, I was arrested in a Pax Christi action at the Trident base in Kings Bay, Georgia. The Trident submarine is the most dangerous weapon ever devised and could destroy 192 targets, such as cities, in less than an hour. After a trial without a jury, I refused probation and spent 6 months in prison, reading many books and working on my appeal.
Was it Cesar Chavez or Rosa Parks that day? Some say Dr. King or Gandhi that set them on their way. No matter who your mentors are, it's pretty plain to see that if you've been to jail for justice, you're in good company. Have you been to jail for justice? I want to shake your hand, 'cause sitting in and lying down are ways to take a stand. Have you sung a song for freedom or marched that picket line? Have you been to jail for justice? Then you're a friend of mine. Hey, you law-abiding citizens, come listen to this song. Laws are made by people, and people can be wrong. Once unions were against the law, but slavery was fine. Women were denied the vote, while the children worked the mine. Yeah, the more you study history, the less you can deny it. Say a rotten law stays on the books till folks with guts defy it.
After returning to Ojai, I began writing the multi-volume Ethics of Civilization. As an idealist, I believe that the soul is more real than the physical body. The soul is the source of awareness. Without the life and consciousness of the soul, we would not even know that physical things exist. In 1987, I had published Life as a Whole, Principles of Education Based on a Spiritual Philosophy of Love. And I formulated 27 ideals as divine principles. They are absolute but have relative opposites that are limited and temporary. Just as light is more real than darkness. I believe these are practical guides for living well. They are goodness, truth, beauty, reality, awareness, joy, love, wisdom, power, life, growth, fruition, will, freedom, responsibility, creativity, balance, harmony, law, justice, peace, wholeness, health, and perfection. The soul is aided by the physical senses, memory, imagination, feeling, reason, intuition, and will. Senses perceive the physical world. Memory enables us to learn from the past. Imagination aids our planning for the future. Feelings help us evaluate our experience. Reason uses logic to organize complex concepts. Intuition perceives complex ideas directly. And will is how we exercise freedom of choice. As an optimist, I always seek what is best. On September 1st, I founded the nonprofit World Peace Communications. And in 2002, we published the Wisdom Bible. In December, I began running for president. In January 2003, at a CPR meeting in this room, I was on a panel, and my open letter to UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, which 79 people signed, was sent to him. I published the Nonviolent Action Handbook and the Massive Guides to Peace and Justice, which later became the 2-volume History of Peace. In February, millions of people marched in protest against the impending invasion of Iraq. During the first week of the illegal Iraq War, I was arrested at Vandenberg Air Force Base twice and at the federal courthouse in Los Angeles. After a month in jail, I was convicted without a jury on the day Bush declared mission accomplished. I refused probation and got 3 more months. I had ended my presidential campaign by endorsing Dennis Kucinich. When I ran again in 2011, I published Progressive Democracy.
I've been waiting for something to happen for a week or a month or a year, with the blood and the ink of the headlines and the sound of the crowd in my ear. You might ask what it takes to remember when you know that you've seen it before, where a government lies to its people and a country is drifting to war. There's a shadow in the faces of the men who send the guns to the wars that are fought in places where their business interest runs. On the radio, talk shows, and TV, you hear one thing again and again, how the USA stands for freedom, and we come to the aid of a friend. But who are the ones that we call our friends? These governments killing their own, or the people who finally can't take any more, and they pick up a gun or a brick or a stone. And there are lives in the balance. There are people under fire. There are children on the cannons, and there is blood on the wire.
In this time of crisis for our country and the world, some fall into despair and depression. The Chinese concept for crisis contains the characters for danger and opportunity. As an optimist, I consider any problem a challenge and an opportunity to improve this world. As a teacher and a writer, my focus has always been on ethics, which is how people treat each other. The golden rule is to do to others what you would have them do to you. The silver rule is not to do to others what you do not want them to do to you. These are found in all major religions and can be summarized as loving others as we love ourselves. Physical evolution is a long process of seemingly random changes in genes guided by selective reproduction. As humans who can learn and use language, we are involved in a much more rapid process of conscious evolution through education. The historian Arnold Toynbee wrote that civilization is a race between education and catastrophe. We are now in a critical phase of that evolution, having created genocidal weapons. In my book, Uniting Humanity by Spiritual Evolution and Democratic Revolution, I offer solutions to the mega crisis of climate, poverty, and war. We are involved in a great experiment to see if the dominant species on this planet can learn to solve our conflicts and problems peacefully. Wars have accompanied human civilization since it developed about 5,000 years ago. Now, as Martin Luther King prophetically said, quote, "It is no longer a choice, my friends, between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence, and the alternative to disarmament, the alternative to a greater suspension of nuclear tests, the alternative to strengthening the United Nations and thereby disarming the whole world may well be a civilization plunged into the abyss of annihilation, and our earthly habitat would be transformed into an inferno," unquote. I believe that in the next few decades, humanity must learn to transform its political institutions to eliminate the dangers of war, alleviate excessive economic inequality, and develop sustainable energy and agriculture to stabilize the climate. If these three goals are not accomplished, billions of people may die, and much of the earth may become uninhabitable. Love is the answer. Excuse me. As it has been taught by the Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, Socrates, Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and countless others. I believe that love will transform our society to one of peace and justice. Victor Hugo wrote, quote, "An invasion of armies can be resisted, but not an idea whose time has come."
Love, love, love. There's nothing you can do that can't be done. Nothing you can sing that can't be sung. Nothing you can say, but you can learn how to play the game. It's easy. Nothing you can make that can't be made. No one you can save that can't be saved. Nothing you can do, but you can learn how to be you in time. It's easy. All you need is love. All you need is love. All you need is love. Love. Love is all you need.
I will describe the major problems we face and will offer what I consider to be the most practical solutions. The consumption of natural resources by our industrialized society is straining the environment. Based on scientific evidence, 98% of climate experts have warned that the emission of greenhouse gases, that's carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, by human activity is causing the Earth to retain more heat absorbed from the sun. Global warming is melting glaciers and permafrost, causing extreme weather with destructive storms. Warmer air holds more moisture, causing wet regions, more rain, melting snow, and floods. In dry regions, global warming causes more heat waves, droughts, and wildfires. Rising oceans flood coasts, and excessive carbon increases ocean acidification. Continued global warming with less glaciers, permafrost, and snow would reduce freshwater in rivers with devastating consequences for agriculture, industry, and domestic use. Most of the carbon emissions that are causing global warming have come from the wealthy industrialized nations in the north, namely in North America, Europe, and Northern Asia, in Russia, China, Korea, and Japan. Yet most of the suffering that will be inflicted by climate change will be experienced by the poorer people in the southern nations. Thus, from an ethical viewpoint, the wealthy nations have an immense responsibility, first, to act decisively to prevent as much of the global warming as possible, and second, to aid the poor countries financially in order to mitigate their predicament. In my view, spiritual evolution and democratic revolution can both be enhanced by treating every person in the world as members of the human family. As Jesus taught, when you do it to the least of me, you do it to me. Least of these, you do it to me. When a few have so much more than they need, the excessive wealth can be shared democratically. Billions of people are suffering poverty because of lack of good health care, education, and economic opportunity.
Imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
A most urgent need is to stop emitting so much carbon into the atmosphere. This could be implemented by taxing all emissions of greenhouse gases from the burning of fossil fuels to deforestation and agricultural practices that impact global warming. All nations must develop more renewable energies, especially solar energy and wind power, as well as conservation, in order to reduce fossil fuels faster. The developed nations with less than 20% of the world's population have emitted nearly 70% of all greenhouse gases. The average American uses 88 times as much energy as a citizen in Bangladesh, which is suffering the most from coastal flooding. The United States, with 4.4% of the world's population, has been emitting about 17% of the carbon. In 2006, China passed up the U.S. as the largest emitter, but China has about 4 times as many people. Americans, Canadians, and Australians emit about 20 tons of carbon dioxide per person annually. The next highest developed country is Russia, with 10.5 tons per person. Carbon dioxide accounts for 82% of emissions and stays in the atmosphere for a century or two. All of the 17 warmest years have occurred since 1998. The average temperature in 2016 was 1.3 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels. With more than 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere, the climate is expected to warm another 0.5 degrees Celsius, even if no more carbon is emitted. Leading climatologist James Hansen has advised that 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide is a safe level. In 2012, coal accounted for 44% of carbon dioxide emissions. Methane is 9% of greenhouse gas, but in 2 decades, it causes 87 times as much warming as carbon dioxide. Fracking allows 30% more methane to escape into the atmosphere than conventional gas, making it worse for the climate than oil and as bad as coal. Scientists have estimated that slowing the rate of deforestation 50% by 2030 would save $3.7 trillion in ecological costs. From 2004 to 2013, Brazil reduced its annual deforestation by 80%, and deforestation's greenhouse gas emissions have gone down from 17% to 8%. The best way to diminish the carbon dioxide already in the atmosphere is to convert industrial farms to organic agriculture by using agroecological methods such as organic farming without pesticides and artificial fertilizers, and using diverse crops, soil conservation, cover crops, crop rotation, and composting. These organic techniques cause carbon dioxide to be sequestered naturally in the soil. Indian expert Vandana Shiva has noted that these methods also improve health, create more jobs, reduce poverty, and conserve water. Organic farms absorb up to 2,000 pounds of carbon per acre per year from the atmosphere, while fields using chemical fertilizers emit nearly 300 pounds of carbon per acre each year. If traditional mixed farming is adopted in the world, 2/3 of the excess carbon dioxide could be captured within a half century. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization found that in developing countries, organic farming is 2 to 10 times more productive than plantations which use chemicals. Taxes on pesticides and chemical fertilizers will discourage their use while paying for the negative externalities of their pollution and damage to health. Sweden's tax reduced pesticide by 65%. Insecticides are killing massive numbers of bees, but Greenpeace has informed us that ecological farming can save the bees. Removing water subsidies and taxing industrial feedlots that pollute the environment and endanger health by using antibiotics will make people pay for the actual costs of meat and dairy products. As the eating of meat is reduced, remaining ruminant animals can graze in pastures where the grass sequesters carbon dioxide. So far, sea level has risen by a few inches, making storms and floods such as Katrina and Sandy worse. But this could become several feet by 2100. In November 1970, about 400,000 people died from the Bola cyclone in East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. More than half the people in the world live within 120 miles of the ocean. The cities most vulnerable to flooding are Calcutta, Mumbai, Dhaka, Guangzhou, Ho Chi Minh City, Shanghai, Bangkok, Rangoon, Miami, Haiphong, New York, Tianjin, Tokyo, and Hong Kong. The oceans absorb a quarter of the carbon dioxide emitted by humans and have become acidic. Scientists warn that reversing deadly ocean acidification could take tens of thousands of years.
Some folks want to be like an ostrich, bury their heads in the sand. Some hope that plastic dreams can unclench all those greedy hands. Some hope to take the easy way. Poisons, bombs, they think we need 'em. Don't you know you can't kill all the unbelievers? There's no shortcut to freedom. One blue sky above us, one ocean lapping all our shore, one earth so green and round, who could ask for more? And because I love you, I'll give it one more try. To show my rainbow race, it's too soon to die. Go tell all the little children. Tell all the mothers and fathers too. Now's our last chance to learn to share what's been given to me and you.
More than half the people on Earth live in watersheds of major rivers that are supplied by glaciers or snow in the mountains. About 97% of the freshwater resources on Earth are in the polar regions, which are heating up fast. Climatologists have estimated that if the Earth warms up only 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, about half of the glacier's volume will be gone. With a rise of 4% Celsius, only 1/5 would remain. Most affected by these changes would be billions of people in Asia and Africa. A third of Africans live in drought-prone areas. In 1984, a famine in Ethiopia killed 700,000 people. Foreign aid helped in 1985. And in 1986, about 6 million people were receiving food aid. The very dry Mideast is using up its groundwater. 3 years of drought in Syria, starting in 2008, pushed 2 million Syrians into extreme poverty and provoked the uprising in 2011 that led to a civil war that has killed 450,000 in Syria. That's been called our first climate war. Oil-rich Saudi Arabia can pay for desalination, but Yemen cannot afford to pump water from the sea to higher elevations. India has 1.33 billion people and Pakistan 195 million, and their populations are increasing. In July 2010, nearly 1/5 of Pakistan was flooded. India and Pakistan both have nuclear weapons, and they have fought often over Kashmir. As melting glaciers decrease, India could stop water from the Indus River going to Pakistan. This might trigger a nuclear war that could cause a global nuclear winter with less rainfall and a famine for years. After that devastating interlude, global warming could increase more rapidly. In a warmer climate, malaria, dengue fever, encephalitis, and cholera are especially likely to spread and be more virulent. Malaria has been killing 1 million people a year. In 2010, the United Nations reported that 1/4 of the Earth's land has been affected by desertification. More than half the people in the world today live in water-stressed conditions, and this is expected to increase to 2/3 of humanity in the 2020s. The freshwater crisis is raising food prices, exacerbating malnutrition of the poor. Livestock are responsible for 8% of freshwater use and about 18% of global warming, and beef and dairy are 65% of that. India has 18% of the world's people and of the cattle, but only 2% of the land. Since 1950, the number of farm animals in the world has multiplied by 5, and they now outnumber humans by at least 3 to 1. 12 million tons of grain could feed those who die of hunger and related diseases each year. Yet that amount of grain could be saved if Americans reduced their consumption of beef by 10%. Production of animal protein uses 11 times as much fossil fuel as plant protein. While 1 billion people suffer from malnutrition, most of the corn and soybeans grown are fed to cattle, pigs, and chicken. In the last 2 decades, about 300,000 family farmers in the United States have been driven out of business, and suicide is the leading cause of death among American farmers. In the last decade in India, 250,000 farmers have committed suicide, most by drinking pesticides they used on Monsanto's genetically modified crops. The richest 20% of humans are mostly in the Northern Hemisphere, have been using 77% of the resources, while the poorest 20% barely subsist on 1.5% of them. 3 billion people survive on under $2.50 per day. In order to prevent devastating famines in the future, improved efficiencies such as hydroponics will be needed to feed the growing world population. As resources of water, oil, and fertilizers diminish, this can be done with renewable alternatives. The healthiest foods are vegetables, fruit, and nuts. Gardens produce 4 times as much food as farms. Americans have 1/4 of the 1 billion motor vehicles in the world and use more gasoline than the next 20 nations combined. We need to develop more electric cars. We urgently need a tax on carbon emissions. The cost of solar energy has recently been declining by more than 10% per year. Solar power plants operate without risks, with no fuel costs, and without emitting any carbon. Hydroelectric power provides 16% of the electricity. By 2010, wind was providing 2.5% of all electricity, and it is increasing by more than 25% each year.
Yes, and how many times must a man look up before he can see the sky? Yes, and how many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry? Yes, and how many deaths will it take till he knows that too many people have died? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
And so, one answer is blowing in the wind. For 5 centuries, capitalists have been using mercantilist trade policies, financial markets, interests collected from debts, and military power to exploit most of the world. Since 1980, economic inequality is getting worse as capitalists have been accumulating almost all the increased wealth produced by human labor and the extraordinary advances in technology. The richest 10% own 87% of all assets, while the other 90% of humans make little or no economic progress or suffer from poverty. If we do not implement radical remedies, the next few generations will likely suffer widespread poverty. Billions of people may die from starvation, disease, and war. The nations of the former Soviet Union and its satellite countries have become more capitalist, along with China and Vietnam. China has reduced its poverty rate from 84% to 13% since 1981. Yet, in the world, 836 million people are still living on less than $1.25 a day, mostly in India and sub-Saharan Africa. In the 21st century, the wealth accumulated by the rich has multiplied, and now 8 billionaires have more wealth than the 3.6 billion poorest people. India has the fastest growth in millionaires and the most people in poverty. Wealthy nations are using up natural resources and are increasing the pollution that is threatening to doom billions of people. Developing nations adopting the decadent ways of rich countries will pollute the earth even more. Capitalist governments have neglected to plan rationally to meet human needs, protect the environment, and provide for the future. Adjusted for inflation, the gross world product has increased from $5 trillion in 1950 to $78 trillion in 2014.
In Mr. Thompson's factory, they're making plastic Christmas trees complete with silver tinsel and a geodesic stand. The plastic's mixed in giant vats from some conglomeration that's been piped from deep within the earth through strip mined from the land. And if you question anything, they say, "Why, don't you see? It's absolutely needed for the economy." Oh, garbage, garbage, garbage. Their stocks and their bonds, all garbage. What will they do when their system goes to smash? There's no value to their cash. There's no money to be made, but there's a world to be repaid. Their kids will read in history books about financiers and other crooks and feudalism and slavery and nukes and all their knavery. To history's dustbin they're consigned, along with many other kinds of garbage, garbage. We need to correct the wrongs of capitalism to find better ways of meeting human needs and protecting the Earth's biosystems. Ending poverty by helping the poor fulfill their basic needs will give them money to spend and a better chance of contributing to society. Mahatma Gandhi believed that nonviolence needs to be the first law of society. He also advised that the more equal distribution of wealth should be the second law, because these two principles will end poverty, wars, and bloody revolutions. Economic reforms to reverse the trend toward greater inequality of wealth can be implemented by progressive tax reform in the richer countries as well as in poor nations, which also have a few capitalists sucking wealth from the economy. Tax havens must be exposed and eliminated, and trade policies need to be made fair for all rather than be licenses for capitalist exploitation. Past injustices need to be corrected and compensated. Poor nations with large debts to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, could have the interest they have paid subtracted from the principal.
The real earnings of 100 million workers in America were less in 2007 than they were when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980. Then in 2008, workers were hit by the Great Recession. In the 1950s, the highest U.S. income tax rate was 91%, but under Reagan, it was reduced to 50% in 1982 and to 28% in 1988. After the Glass-Steagall Banking Act of 1933 was repealed in 1999, bankers were allowed to gamble with government-guaranteed deposits. From 1974 to 2009, U.S. manufacturing declined from 22% of GDP, that's a gross national domestic product, to 12%, while the FIRE sector, which stands for finance, insurance, and real estate, rose from 15% to 21%. U.S. corporate lobbyists spent $100 million in 1975, but this lobbying increased to $3.5 billion by 2010. That year, the U.S. Supreme Court legalized corruption with its Citizens United decision, which equated political bribes with free speech. The 1920s theory that increased income for the rich will trickle down to the middle class and poor was disproven by the Great Depression of the 1930s and in the Great Recession that began in 2008. By 2016, U.S. student debt was more than $1.4 trillion, owed by 44 million borrowers. From 2000 to 2009, the number of American children in poverty increased by a third. Only 7% of American workers in the private sector are currently in unions. During the so-called recovery from 2009 to 2012, incomes of the bottom 90% went down by 7%, while the incomes of the richest 10% grew by 116%. During the years 2007 to 2012, there were 34 million U.S. foreclosures and foreclosure starts. In the past 30 years, international trade has increased from $3 trillion a year to $30 trillion, and it is growing 50% faster than global production. The U.S. and its imperial allies have exploited and controlled international trade by devaluing the currencies of other nations. They have done this by using the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, the General Agreement on Trades and Tariffs, GATT, the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the World Trade Organization, WTO, and the Multilateral Agreement on Investments. The United States controls the World Bank, and the managing director of the IMF is always a European with a North American deputy. Both institutions operate from Washington, D.C. The U.S. benefits from the dollar being the international currency. Poor nations have to pay 18% interest on their loans, but the U.S. borrows money at 3%. Now, in 2017, the total debt of federal, state, and local American governments is $23 trillion. The IMF has forced poor nations to control inflation and remove barriers to trade and capital flow by freeing banks, reducing government spending, and selling their assets to foreign investors. From 1980 to 1996, countries in sub-Saharan Africa paid twice their total debt in interest and ended up owing 3 times as much. This usury transferred massive natural resources from poor nations to the rich. Wealthy countries give their farmers subsidies of $350 billion a year, which is 6 times as much as they give to poor countries in aid. Poor nations cannot prevent imported cheap goods from ruining their markets because the WTO and the IMF do not let them support their own farmers. Rich nations impose tariffs 4 times higher on the imports from poor countries than they do on those from wealthy nations. Only 29 of the 500 largest corporations in the world are in developing countries.
Build the road of peace before us. Build it wide and deep and long. Speed the slow. Remind the eager. Help the weak and guide the strong. None shall push aside another. None shall let another fall. Joy, joy, O sisters and brothers, all for one and one for all.
European mixed economies combine open markets and free trade for consumer goods while providing beneficial regulations and public services for necessities such as health care, education, utilities, roads, and law enforcement. Worker self-management enables employees to control companies democratically. Giving corporations political rights makes a mockery of democratic elections, giving financial entities an unfair advantage. Fascism combines military and corporate power and has been responsible for wars and genocide. Democratic governments can regulate corporations to protect human health and the environment. Ralph Nader has described corporate crimes that have been increasing in the past 40 years. Fair trade does not allow exploitation. Tariffs can be imposed to pay for the costs of transporting products long distances. Revenues from fair trade tariffs can be rebated to poor countries to nourish their starving economies. Poor nations can develop market economies by expanding their agriculture and manufacturing. Less long-distance shipping of heavy products helps relieve climate crisis. Economic democracy can rein in the arbitrary power of large corporations and require them to give employees the right to vote on corporate policies. Single-payer health care with the government paying for all medical expenses is more efficient than the private health care insurance system still used in the United States. Governments providing education and health care can be obligated to take care of everyone equally and are more efficient than private profit-making, which rejects those who are too expensive to serve. Healthcare, education, and retirement income for all are the best investments our society can make to assure a good future for everyone. Government can finance solar energy, windmills, retrofitting buildings, and sustainable agriculture. We can subsidize medical clinics, local manufacturing, and low-income housing. Green taxes can be enacted to protect the environment and people from pollution. Reducing the work week creates more jobs. Once wars are stopped for good, taxes will no longer be wasted on military spending. Then humanity can work together to help people out of abject poverty, and the human race will be closer to living in a paradise on this limited earth. Governments can assure justice with elections, laws, courts, and institutions of correction, as well as security with police and fire departments. Governments can finance roads, trains, airports, bridges, tunnels, and electrical utilities. People still have the choice to use businesses. However, if the government neglects to provide these services without discriminating, the private sector is unlikely to do so for everyone.
If I had a song, I'd sing it in the morning. I'd sing it in the evening, all over this land. I'd sing out danger. I'd sing out a warning. I'd sing out love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. Well, I've got a hammer, and I've got a bell, and I've got a song to sing all over this land. It's the hammer of justice. It's the bell of freedom. It's the song about love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. It's the hammer of justice. It's the bell of freedom. It's the song about love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land. The highest priority must be given to stopping the deaths that have been occurring because of lack of clean water, diseases, wars, and crimes often committed over illegal drugs. Such drugs could be decriminalized and regulated so that they can be taxed with the revenues funding treatment programs for addicts. As the poor become better educated, the high birth rate of 5 children per woman in Africa will decline naturally, as it has in Latin America and India. Republicans have become more conservative and primarily serve the interests of the wealthy. Democrats cater to the middle class and wealthy interests while caring for the poor. Both parties favor campaign donors. The lobbyists who influence legislatures most are the military-industrial complex, financial services, the fossil fuels industry, and private healthcare with its insurance providers and drug industry. About $6 billion was spent in the 2016 elections. In addition, Donald Trump received $5.2 billion in free media time, compared to $3.2 billion for Hillary Clinton. Bernie Sanders received very little. And the best candidate by far, Jill Stein of the Green Party, received practically no free media coverage at all. The elections are contests and should have fair rules. 17 U.S. intelligence agencies found that Russia illegally favored Donald Trump and harmed Hillary Clinton. Of the 21 most advanced nations, the U.S. spends the least on public social programs. Of those wealthier nations, the United States is last in inequality, poverty, life expectancy, infant mortality, maternity leave, and the environment. The U.S. has the most people in prisons and jails, holding a quarter of all who are imprisoned in the world. In the past half-century, the United States has tripled its economic output, but the wages of the middle class have stagnated, and people's general happiness has not increased. Studies show that when people with higher incomes increase their wealth, they do not become happier. But when the poor get a raise, they do feel happier. The Clinton administration balanced the budget and created a surplus, and the projection was for a $5.6 trillion surplus in the next 10 years. Yet Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan argued that federal deficits would be better than letting the federal government develop capital, which could compete with private corporations. Big tax cuts for the rich under George W. Bush and his wars in Afghanistan and Iraq turned this surplus into a 10-year deficit of $6.2 trillion. The money was borrowed from the wealthy who collect interest on their loans without working, taking money from the general public. The illegal Iraq war since 2003 may have caused nearly 1 million deaths, and the two wars cost $5 trillion by the end of 2016. Yet, these war criminals have not been prosecuted. Spending for veterans, homeland security, and interest on the debt from military spending bring the total the United States has budgeted for national security in 2017 to $1.35 trillion. I believe that the Green Party has the best policies, but the powerful Democrat and Republican parties have dominated the rigged system so much that the Green Party has been excluded from debates and hampered by difficult ballot access. The Green Party's policies are based on economic democracy, nonviolence, social justice, and ecological sustainability. And it is
the fastest growing political party in the world. Instead of choosing between the lesser of two evils, instant runoff voting or ranked choice voting allows people to vote their conscience by ranking their first three choices. The winner ends up with a majority of votes, making runoff elections unnecessary, while letting voters whose first choice is eliminated have a vote between the leading vote getters. In 2016, many could have voted for Greens first and Democrats second, with others voting for Libertarians first and Trump second. This could break the two-party domination. Until then, I advise Democratic Greens to cooperate with progressive and Green Democrats. Progressive policies are becoming more popular. Polls show that most Americans oppose the wars. They favor raising the minimum wage and tuition-free public colleges. Most want compassionate immigration policies, controlling deadly weapons of mass murder, and taxing the very wealthy. If asked, I believe they would likely support taxing stock trading and carbon emissions. In my book, I propose new constitutions for the United States and for the United Nations to make them both more democratic. For the U.S., I suggest giving territories representation, making the Senate more representative of the people, allowing the people to vote by email on legislation, electing department ministers to 6-year terms, limiting judicial appointments to 9-year terms, providing free public education and health care, limiting campaign donations to $100, providing debates for all candidates, having rotating regional primaries, replacing the war on drugs with treatment, using restorative justice, and restricting weapons.
Oh, say, can we see by the one light in all our earth to embrace at the call of all nations, where our children can play in a world without war, where we stand hand in hand in the grace of creation, where the rivers run clean through the forests of green, where the cities stand tall in the clear skies of freedom. Oh, say do our hearts sing for harmony and love forever on the planet of our birth, blessed with peace on earth.
Humans developed civilization and have engaged in increasingly destructive wars, with various empires rising and falling. Now, our American empire has the most powerful military ever. Yet, others also have weapons of mass destruction. Empires collapse for 4 reasons: environmental degradation, economic injustice, militarism, and domestic upheaval. I believe that what makes the United States great is not our military power, but our ideals of freedom and equal rights. Our dominating and aggressive foreign policy reduces freedom, increases economic inequality, wastes resources, and adds to pollution. Thus, the United States has been leading the world in the wrong direction. As citizens of this country, we are responsible for correcting our national policies. If we could get Americans to live up to our best ideals and reform our unjust policies, then the United States could help lead the world in moving toward disarmament and peace. in solving global warming, and in reducing poverty. Leaders of nations threaten and use military force against other people with the usual result that those people fight back, making the entire situation much worse. Rather than attacking people or punishing them, individuals can be held responsible for their actions by a nonviolent process of justice and reconciliation. If we value human life, our actions should promote human survival and avoid killing people. The essential necessities of life are breathing fresh air, having access to clean water, food, and shelter. The next best investment is education, which enables people to lead successful lives. A good democracy depends on informed voters. A good society will provide health care as a human right for all people. Justice with equal human rights should be the basis of legislation, administration, and adjudication. I consider wars social insanity, and such mass murder must be forever banned and stopped, just as any other criminal activity is. If we do not reverse global warming, the social consequences of the resulting misery will increase the danger of massive human conflicts. Now is the time for humanity to join together and stop the folly of war. Only a mad person would use nuclear weapons, but in a desperate crisis, someone could go crazy. The people of the world must decide to unite our efforts and prevent the scourge of war from destroying our civilization. Nuclear weapons are the worst and should be the first weapons that are dismantled. In the last 5,000 years, about 200 million people have been killed in wars, more than half since the beginning of the 20th century.
For I marched to the battles of the German trench in a war that was bound to end all wars. Oh, I must have killed 1 million men, and now they want me back again, but I ain't marching any more. It's always the old to lead us to the war, always the young to fall. Now look at all we've won with the saber and the gun. Tell me, is it worth it all? For I flew the final mission in the Japanese sky, set off the mighty mushroom roar. When I saw the cities burning, I knew that I was learning that I ain't marching anymore.
The 5 major nations that won World War II were given veto power in the Security Council of the United Nations and are the United States, Russia, Britain, France, and China. These 5 nations were the first to develop nuclear weapons and still have 98% of them. Since 1946, wars have killed about 20 million people, and the U.S. has intervened militarily 73 times, killing several million people in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In 1950, President Truman approved National Security Council Directive 68 to establish covert and overt warfare. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, has overthrown the governments of Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, and Chile in 1973. About 2 million people died in the Vietnam War. In the 1980s, the U.S. sent military aid to the Mujahideen fighting in Afghanistan and to help Iraq's Saddam Hussein against Iran. The United States committed war crimes in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Panama, Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, and Libya. In 2016, U.S. Special Operations Forces were deployed in 138 nations in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons was signed in 1968. Many nations agreed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries. The 5 nuclear powers promised in Article 6, quote, to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament," unquote. In flagrant violation of this treaty and the UN Charter, the 9 nuclear nations are threatening the world with genocidal weapons and thus are criminals. The Nuremberg Principles of International Law, formulated by the war crimes tribunals held in Nuremberg, Germany after the end of World War II, clearly define crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Nuclear bombs and advancing military technology threaten humans with mutual destruction unless our society learns how to resolve conflicts without the massive violence of wars. In December 1989, Soviet Premier Gorbachev and U.S. President George H.W. Bush agreed to end the Cold War and begin an era of peace. Their decision to let reunited Germany stay in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was confirmed in February 1990 when the American Secretary of State, James Baker, promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch to the east. The Eastern Alliance of the Warsaw Pact disbanded in February 1991. However, the NATO alliance was extended to Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary in 1999. In 2004, NATO took in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania. And in April 2009, it added Albania and Croatia. The 1999 Convention prohibiting landmines was not joined by the United States and China. The US, China, Israel, Pakistan, India, and North Korea refused to accept the 2001 Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. That year, the United States withdrew from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and the 1972 Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention. In 2002, the International Criminal Court was rejected by the US, China, Israel, and others. The Bush administration, by threatening to cut off aid, bullied 101 nations into signing bilateral immunity agreements, but 53 governments refused to sign. There are now 65 million refugees in the world. The United States, with drone attacks, has murdered more than 4,000 people. Last October, the UN General Assembly voted 123 to 38 for negotiations in 2017 to ban nuclear weapons, but 27 members of NATO voted no. In 2015, the United States sold $40 billion in weapons to other nations. France, $15 billion, Russia, $11 billion, and China, $6 billion. The United States could help de-escalate wars it provoked in the Mideast by withdrawing its forces and stopping all weapons sales and military aid. United Nations peacekeeping forces could be strengthened and greatly expanded in order to bring to justice war criminals and encourage others to stop fighting. America could greatly reduce its military spending by stopping the production of weapons, closing hundreds of foreign military bases, by ending the sale of weapons, and by leading the way toward nuclear disarmament. Then, by negotiation, all nuclear weapons could be reduced and eliminated. Progress toward global integration has been made by regional developments, such as the Organization of American States, the European Union, the Organization of African Unity, the Organization of the Islamic Conference, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, and the Alliance for Small Island States. The United Nations now includes 193 countries. To replace the previous war system, the United Nations can be made democratic. When the people of the world agree to a democratic constitution for the United Nations, power will be shared by the people of all nations, instead of being held by one military superpower and a few other powerful nations.
Last night I had the strangest dream I ever dreamed before. I dreamed the world had all agreed to put an end to war. I dreamed I saw a mighty room. The room was filled with men, and the paper they were signing said they'd never fight again. And when the papers all were signed and 1,000,000 copies made, they all joined hands and bowed their heads, and grateful prayers were prayed.
Crimes by fanatical terrorists, warlords, and criminal leaders of nations can be stopped by United Nations peacekeeping forces as world laws treat all people and nations equally. Volunteers from every nation can provide UN peacekeepers who could be organized regionally so that people can resolve their own conflicts. Yet, if a region should have a serious conflict requiring outside assistance to solve, then other UN peacekeepers could be authorized to intervene by a democratic United Nations. Human rights can be protected in every nation by bringing violators to account nationally, or if necessary, by a World Court of Justice. No ruthless dictator nor government, even if it claims to be democratic, would be allowed to oppress people or attack other nations with armed forces. The Earth Charter was initiated by Maurice Strong and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1994, drafted by a commission in 1997, and was recognized by the United Nations in 2002. In 2011, the Occupy movement drafted its United for Global Democracy. Various conventions on human rights have provided a foundation for a democratic world government that could outlaw war and supervise disarmament. My proposal for a United Nations democracy includes the following reforms: a democratically elected Congress to legislate world laws passed by majority votes in the General Assembly and in a House of Delegates that are approved by a majority of the people in the world voting by email, and by the 6 of the 9 presidents elected. They would represent the following 9 regions: China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa with West Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, North Asia, North America, and South America. The 9 presidents would appoint 9 judges to the World Supreme Court for 9-year terms. The Executive Council of 9 presidents, by a 2/3 vote, could enforce the world laws by sending police and peacekeepers. With one common currency, global capital movement would be like capital movement is today within national economies or within the Eurozone. Tax havens for $21 trillion could be eliminated. In my view, the dove of world peace has the right wing of justice through world law and the left wing of peace by nonviolence and love. My Nonviolent Action Handbook explains nonviolence as open friendliness, honest communication, respect for freedom and equality, courageous compassion, detached trusting, and patient persistence. I warn against the 7 deadly isms of sexism, racism, imperialism, militarism, materialism, dogmatism, and egotism. I advise the group processes of affinity groups with spokes councils and consensus decision-making. Strategies are investigation, research, negotiation, arbitration, public education, vigils, demonstrations, boycotts and strikes, legal suits, non-cooperation, civil disobedience following nonviolence guidelines, fasting, constructive and charitable activities, and other acts of conscience.
Listen, I believe everything we dream can come to pass through our union. We can turn the world around. We can turn the earth's revolution. We have the power. People have the power. People have the power. People have the power. The power to dream, to rule, to wrestle the earth from fools. Well, it's decreed the people rule. Yes, it's decreed the people rule. We have the power. We have the power. Yes, people have the power.
Social and economic justice movements that include concerns for peace, civil rights, worker rights, ecology, anti-nuclear, women's rights, sexual preference rights, and for climate change action have all been organized in recent decades and can work together now in this mega crisis that threatens us all. The election of Donald Trump as President of the United States has awakened this nation and the world to the serious dangers we face and the need for both spiritual awakening and democratic revolution to bring about a peaceful world with liberty and justice for all. I predict that Trump will be impeached, and the sooner the better. The Republicans will realize that Pence is not as bad. Then, in the 2018 elections, the growing coalition of progressive Democrats, Greens, and Socialists can make major gains in 2020 begin reforming the United States.
For the first time in my life, I feel like a prisoner, a slave to the ways of the powers that be. And I fear for my children as I fear for the future I see. Tell me, how can it be we're still fighting each other? What does it take for a people to learn? If our song is not sung as a chorus, we surely will burn. What are we making weapons for? Why keep on feeding the war machine? We take it right out of the mouths of our babies. Take it away from the hands of the poor. Tell me, what are we making weapons for? Have we forgotten all the lives that were given? All the vows that were taken? Saying never again. Now for the first time, this could be the last time. If peace is our vision, let us begin.
What's the first step? Reading one of your books?
Well, I guess that could be one way. Educate yourself. But I just listed many different things we can do in terms of influencing other people. We can work to elect the right people. We can lobby Congress. We can protest the things that are wrong. We can live on an income where we don't have to pay taxes to the federal government. We can talk to other people about these things. There's just any number of things, and there's a lot of different ways to express ourselves. We can live peacefully ourselves and get along with people better and be loving and kind. There's just so many different things that a person can do, and nobody can do everything. So it's nice that people can do different things.
Sanderson, I'm wondering, you've done so many things. Is there one that's particularly heartwarming to you that you might share with us, an incident that just is something you look back and say, wow, I'm glad I was part of that?
Wow, that's like all the things I mentioned. I guess being a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War was what started my process. Although that really wasn't that hard, I never got called. But and then I guess the first time I was arrested maybe was significant because I wasn't that big of a an opponent of nuclear power, but I heard they were doing nonviolence trainings. Anyway, I got involved. And being with those people, I saw people were dedicated to a combination of things. There was nonviolence, they were concerned about peace. There was the environment, they were concerned about that. They were concerned about women's rights. They were concerned about consensus decision-making, the poor. It was a really beautiful blend of those things together. And being with people in a separated, we weren't in a regular prison, we were in this old gym, and having these meetings, that was, I guess, the most transformative.
Thank you.
I never realized that till now.
I've been partial to a study, you may have heard of it, Generations, A History of America's Future. It proposes that the United States, I'll say the United States, gets itself into a crisis every 80 years or so, 80 to 100 years. And we're in that time right now. So you're well-rounded in your knowledge, and I was wondering if you might pull out of the future there, maybe with your astrology or something, that do you think that we could hit a crisis as drastic as the past three for the United States, the War of Independence, the Civil War, and the last one we've had was the twin emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II. Now that 80-year gap is with us today. So do you think we could hit that heart of, point?
I'm so glad you asked that question, Michael, because I have a really good answer to that. I am an astrologer, and the planet Uranus was discovered in 1781, and it's the ruling planet of Aquarius, and we're in the Aquarian age now, so it's really significant. It has an 84-year cycle. When the Declaration of Independence was signed on 4th of July 1776, it was like the 9th degree or 10th degree of Gemini. 84 years later was when Lincoln was elected and the Civil War started. 84 years after that was D-Day. This is the exact same degree, this 84-year cycle. So I'm looking at 2028 as that cycle returning, as being a very key year for the United States of America. And I've also noticed that the same cycle can be seen in another way. If you look at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in October, they called it October Revolution, 1917, 84 years later, 9/11, 2001. So that 84-year cycle is very significant, especially in the Aquarian age. So it's something to look to. If we can have a peaceful world and a transformed world and a changing world by the year 2020, we'd be doing pretty well.
Well, have you done Trump's horoscope?
No, actually, I know he was born on Flag Day. He's a Gemini, sun in Gemini. But I haven't really looked into it more than that.
Well, if you ever do get around to it, I'd be interested.
Here's an interesting thing that I discovered. I don't know if any of you saw that program about Hitler's charisma on public television. And they was talking about some of the things he did to control people and manipulate and get people to follow him and do what he said and everything, which is, really horrifying what he did. And Trump's doing a lot of those things, like holding a handshake for a really long time, or holding eye contact with the people he's talking to a really long time. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I wonder if there's any similarity in the cycle between Hitler coming to power on January 31st, 1933, and Trump's inauguration on January 20th, 2017. And guess what, folks? 84 years.
Well, I was going to suggest or request that you take some of those statistics, maybe, and make your transcript available online. It would make a great summary on a PowerPoint, and it would be very helpful to actually see it. It's a lot to condense into just an auditory experience, but it does leave an impression.
I do appreciate these suggestions, and I hope to do something about them, because I would like to reach out and expand this. I would like to mention that all of my books, all 33 books that are back there on the table, can be read on my website online. And you can take my card, or there's some free information on one of the tables. There's some free books, by the way, all the nonviolent action handbooks. If you want to take one, please feel free to take one. But you can read all these books, and there's a lot more information, of course, in this book on Uniting Humanity, which I was drawing from mostly for this talk. It is also online.
Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me. Let there be peace on earth, the peace that was meant to be, with God as our parent, family all are we. Let us walk with each other in perfect harmony. Let peace begin with me. Let this be the moment now. With every step I take, let this be my solemn vow, to take each moment and live each moment in peace eternally. Let there be peace on earth, and let it begin with me.